When the actual battle had officially begun at midnight with the Tandem anti-satellite cyber strikes and booting on of electronic warfare assets in the local area from the 58th Signals/E.W Regiment from its electronic warfare battalion, this had completely deadened all of the communications of the various American forces located on the map. And although PLA units had begun their official drives against their first objectives starting at 12:30 a.m. under a heavy barrage launched by not only all of the different artillery battalions, which combined had an aggregate total of 240 howitzers that equipped these battalions, some of the battalions being equipped with the potent Type-83 self-propelled 152mm howitzer, while yet others were equipped with the very capable PLZ-05 155mm self-propelled howitzers, had begun their sheer and complete reign of terror throughout the battlefield. Also, external-based fires coming from the longest-range artillery system in the world, the A300, which equipped a battalion from the 77th PLA Group Army's 77th Artillery Battalion that was sitting in the Fort Sill area during that battle, had launched some strikes into the area upon request, raining down the enormously destructive 300mm rockets within the entertainment district and on an outcropping of militia-like forces in the far northwestern suburbs of the metro area itself. As these forces had emerged, coming out of their buildings, their homes, their farms to take on the PLA, they were promptly surrounded and engaged by potent PLA armored forces. And although the armored battalions of most of these combined arms brigade were already equipped with the vaunted and highly capable Type 96B main battle tanks, with their companies equipped with these of their tank companies, and their anti-tank companies equipped with the equally potent AFT-10s with their 8 pods of HJ-10, which anti-tank missiles, which were among the longest range in the world at a whopping 6.2 miles for an anti-tank missile, and were also fairly large and destructive. The vanguard of the 58th PLA Group Army's heavy forces was in fact not those within the ordinary medium combined arms brigades with their 1 armored battalion apiece with these very capable systems, but was with the 2 armored battalions that equipped the 28th Heavy Combined Arms Brigade, which were equipped with the even more advanced Type-89A, quite possibly the best main battle tank in the world, just from its technical specifications alone and its armor protection. And although the Type 96B incorporated many of the same technologies and armor protection, these were in fact 2 different tanks, even though they looked similar, because the 99 had certain features and extra technologies that the 96B just didn't possess. One critical one of mention is the Chinese trophy-like system equivalent, which could blast incoming ATGMs while they were still airborne, even before they had an opportunity to penetrate any of the armor on the tank. That just being one of the extra technologies that equipped these tanks, as the 99A was in a league of its own as a main battle tank. And again, although the 96B was very, very capable and potent and had very strong armor, a tungsten steel alloy composite armor like the 99A, and could have extra ERA kits or NERA applique armor, which was often the case, it was a different tank than the 99A. And the 99A, again, was the vanguard of the tank forces of this group army and many others. They also had the equally high-tech and impressive QN506 tank destroying system, which had equal capabilities to tear infantry to pieces. It wasn't just a menace against armor like the AFT-10, which could destroy vehicles and buildings, and it could eliminate infantry, although its primary purpose was to hit hardened structures or especially tanks and heavily armored vehicles. This vehicle system was equipped with weapons that could equally shred clusters of infantry to pieces, meaning that it was fully capable of defending itself when attacked head-on by infantry forces, as it not only had its own loitering munition type weapon systems, which were technically, in a way, a miniature cruise missile. It also had rockets, small ones, and it had anti-tank missiles and 30mm autocannons, plural. It had a few of these. And it had many sensors equipped throughout it, and its own quadcopter reconnaissance asset and dual grenade launchers, and was also protected by ERA armor or NERA applique armor kits, which could be installed upon it and frequently were. This was a very high-tech and destructive anti-tank / anti-infantry system, as the AFT-10, if attacked head-on, the very powerful and long-range HJ-10 anti-tank missiles, which had that 6.2-mile range, wouldn't do much good in a very close encounter with infantry forces, like could the systems aboard this QN-506, as the grenades, the 30mm autocannons, and the rockets it carried would shred infantry that were within close quarters of it to pieces, while the AFT-10 was a more distant weapons platform that could destroy infantry, but was especially useful against armor and buildings with their powerful HJ-10s. The mechanized infantry forces within this combined arms brigade, like those of the other combined arms brigades present, although in place of an additional mechanized infantry battalion, it had an extra armored battalion. These were equipped with the extremely capable, brand new, state-of-the-art VN-20 infantry fighting vehicles, which had many of the same technologies that the ZBD-04 possessed, with additional technologies, and instead of the HJ-08 or HJ-09 pods, it had the HJ-12E missiles on either side, one each on either side of its turret. They were well protected by ERA or NERA plating, as seen here. And the vehicle was covered in ERA or NERA plating and had a lower silhouette than even did the ZBD-04A, which itself was a highly destructive and very advanced system, with this even a step up from that. Although it had the same main weapon systems, such as the 100mm main gun, the 30mm autocannon, which was connected to it, and the 7.62 by 54mm machine gun on the turret, with the other vehicles consisting of the Type-89A armored personnel carriers with their heavy machine gun turrets, which were equipped with the W85 12.7mm heavy machine gun for their other vehicles within the mechanized infantry, as all of the mechanized infantry battalions were all set up in the exact same format with all the different combined arms brigades, including the 28th Heavy Combined Arms Brigade itself. As these forces had been driven away early on by the thunderous and earth-shaking artillery strikes from the 300mm rockets, as well as the howitzer fires coming in right away from the howitzer artillery equipping the Type 83 152mm self-propelled howitzer artillery that equipped the 190th Combined Arms Brigade's artillery battalion coming in with the 300mm long-range rockets, these over 400 armed American civilians had retreated into an area along with over 400 others that were to their south that moved into this area, with the ones in the north more scared away by being in such close proximity of these different artillery strikes against this armed civilian militia-like element, which caused them to flee to this area to the south and away from this, while the ones in the south were more trying to move into the area to get on the highways and get the hell out of Dodge, although they intended to fight back right off the bat. And many others had already fled the city. They didn't bother trying to move towards the city in any way, shape, or form, but had gotten out using tertiary roads or secondary roads that hadn't, as of that moment, been captured yet by the PLA forces. Whereas these forces moving to a highway system, which was a primary objective of the PLA, because I-40 went up this way, they had basically gotten themselves into a predicament upon which they could not easily get themselves out of. With the two mechanized infantry battalions within the 28th Heavy Combined Arms Brigade being tasked with surrounding them and eliminating them, this battle would go on for quite some time, as between 12:30 and 1:30 a.m., these battalions had moved in from the south and fanned out their companies and began to form a ring around these nearly 1,000 total fighting men that were reactionary armed civilians that intended to put up a fight. Upon having had created a cordon around these American elements, the artillery battalion, the PLZ-05, self-propelled 155mm howitzers, had begun to fire an array of artillery strikes with DPICM ammunition and predominantly HE ammunition against these forces anywhere the ISR assets of the high altitude or satellite spotted them, or increasingly, as these forces moved in, the local quadcopter assets helped in performing even more precision strikes. Although many of these forces had gone into hiding in drainage ditches, including in culverts that ran under streets, which was actually a wise choice considering the circumstances, or in certain buildings, these forces had begun to shrink the perimeter, constantly engaging these nearly 1,000 armed American civilians. It was approximately 950 total, because each of these icons is over 200. Variations of 220, 240, or 210, they all combined to become about 950 total. And as they had ran into this area, the fighting on the shrinking perimeter was intense, as methodically, as this was a 3.5-hour battle, very methodically, the PLA forces were going down all streets, kicking in the doors of all buildings, where they tended to ignore completely unarmed civilians, as was the case in other battles. Although strictly looking for those with a weapon in their hand, this still took them quite some time to clear this entire area while pressing in against these armed reactionary civilians, which caused this battle to take such a long time as they were clearing this area as they incrementally pushed in, which caused the remaining armed reactionary civilians to increasingly press their backs against one another as the clearance of these areas leading inward was essentially causing such a reaction for these forces to increasingly be pressed against one another. Now we go to the map of this particular battle, which was occurring at the same time as the battle at the OG&E plant was occurring, or wrapping up rather, and the fighting to capture the water sewage treatment plant guarded by the remains of the last two companies that survived of the 2nd Battalion 290th Infantry Regiment, which was a reserve unit of American troops, essentially a training-oriented force that had been mobilized to guard the Will Rogers International Airport with alphabet paramilitary elements in their SWAT gear, as well as to guard this sewage and water treatment plant that was literally just north of a guard armory that had been struck by cruise missiles by this point. And the forces over here were being increasingly squeezed inward as the armored forces, after capturing the Mustang gas plant, the electric power plant, moved into this area. And also over here, the fighting in downtown was hitting a fever pitch by this point. And the fighting over here was also wrapping up against the 545th Brigade Engineering Battalion, which essentially was more like a special troops battalion than just a complete combat engineer battalion within the 45th Infantry Brigade combat team, before these forces would resupply their logistics and press against their final military target, being the 1st Squadron, or essentially a battalion in CAV terms, of the 180th Cav Regiment. Going to the map. This area on this map is a 1 mile by 1 kilometer north to south, east to west, 1 mile, in terms of its total scale. There are 2 PLA mechanized infantry companies present on this map that are going around the roads. This is I-44 right here. And this is where a wide boulevard converts into a highway segment that connects I-44 with State Highway 66 that's literally just to the north and off this map. In this area, you have some streets that go around here. You have some businesses like right here and here and here. And over here, what you have is you have some more small businesses and here, and also a shop right here, and like one of those large mega gas stations with the pumps. So essentially this is the shop and this is the large gas pump right here. These forces are already at the very opening of this map, these armed reactionary civilians, being heavily hit by artillery, also heavy 120 millimeter mortars from the assault gun mortars, the PLL E.W that equipped the Mechanized Infantry Battalion's fire support companies of this battalion and the other battalion that have surrounded and were closing in on these forces that you see on the map. There are 2 companies from each battalion pictured of the 2 mechanized infantry battalions. You have the combat elements of 1 company right here with their headquarters platoon, which was their command and logistical elements just off the map and to the south. Whereas you have another company right here with their combat platoons. And they have all been dismounting their forces with 1 platoon of dismounts, 1 squad, 1 squad, 1 squad, another squad, and another squad right here from this platoon on the very end. And these 2 platoons have not dismounted their forces yet, but they intended upon doing so upon going beneath this highway overpass of this little segment that connects the State Highway 66 with the interstate of I-44 right here. Of I-40 right here. Excuse me. As these forces are also being hit by 130 millimeter rockets coming from the Type 63 light artillery rocket systems, not to be confused with the Type 63 armored personnel carrier. These 130 millimeter rockets are splashing in this area with 120 millimeter mortars from the PLL E.W, not to be confused with the larger PLZ E.W, which is a self-propelled howitzer, but the PLL E.W assault gun / mortar, which could be used either as a direct fire weapon or as a mortar. And right off the bat, as these mortars and rockets are landing in this area, they're wiping out an ample number of armed reactionary civilians that are trying to flee from all these mechanized infantry forces that have surrounded and were closing in on them. As this part of the battle was the final part of the 3.5-hour battle. This was the last approximately 40 minutes of it. And the battle would end at 5 a.m. in this particular zone. As the forces had closed in, they had already lost a few of their vehicles. They had lost 2 of their Type-89A armor personnel carriers to some well-planned Molotov attacks, although these were essentially kamikaze strikes, as all the lives that had partaken in them were lost because the vehicles behind the vehicles that were Molotoved had opened fire and cut all of them down as they were throwing their Molotovs, resulting in dozens of lives being lost in a single throw of the proverbial dice. This did nothing to the overall attacking force, as the damage was distributed among 2 different companies within their platoons, and only 2 vehicles had been lost, with the crews actually bailing out and most surviving except for one that had been popped as he was basically coming out of the driver's hatch by an armed civ that was hiding in a piney area that had camouflaged his IR signature, although fire was promptly returned on that position, which ended that man's life in the process. In this battle, or the last part of this battle rather, there would be a loss of another 2 vehicles, 2 Molotov attacks. 2 vehicles coming from the same platoon of vehicles, which would essentially result in heavy reprisals against those who had conducted this attack, which would be done from being positioned on a highway overpass that was not seen, although they were seen via ISR assets, they were not seen in such a way where the turret machine guns could adequately tear them up like these guys on this end that were trying to fire down at them from this end. As they were on the other side of it, they were outside of the reach of the weapon systems that equipped these forces, as again, these were weapons that were direct fire and not mortar type weapons, although these forces would be hit by some CH-901As moving into the area, as several volleys of CH-901As had been fired by the headquarters battalion of the 28th Heavy Combined Arms Brigade to support their mechanized infantry troops operating in this area, as they methodically went through the area, causing the American reactionary armed civilians to become less and less in number, and now the remainder of them having their backs proverbially against each other and trying to throw up one last-ditch effort at defense. As these forces on Interstate 40 were fleeing, other companies that were just off the map that were working together to surround the area, while 2 companies were sent in to conduct the final phase of this particular operation. As trucks had been moving up this highway, pickup trucks, technicals, if you will, they were viciously machine gunned as the ISR quadcopter assets had spotted them as they were moving up this segment, as this boulevard off the map turned into a highway segment to connect Interstate 40 with State Highway 66. So I-40 was connected to 66 just to the north and off map. As there were other PLA troops on the wide boulevard just off the map, they were firing at them too from the back. And they did not make it very far between the L shape of vectored fire coming from the ground-based fires, while these CH-901A loitering munitions flew over this area and hit some of the vehicles and men moving up the interstate, with the vehicle here, this pickup truck, actually going the wrong direction up the highway, though this mattered little due to the fact that many civilians had abandoned their automobiles entirely within the metro area. As soon as battle had gotten nearer to them, they realized the folly of trying to stay in a vehicle which presented itself as a relatively large target to enemy forces, and figured that they had a better opportunity on foot, which to an extent they actually did, but still, if they were that close to enemy forces, they had to essentially navigate the crossfire that would be occurring between their own forces, be they armed civilians or be they paramilitary alphabet elements or local paramilitary SWAT forces, or be they military forces. They had to contend with the crossfire between the PLA and them. Here, these vehicles coming around this corner had been shredded up by small arms fire and also loitering munitions entering here, and also rocket strikes from 130mm rockets, such as what happened to this pickup truck on the very end of this road right here, as these forces in this field and in this wooded area that had been spotted moving into it had taken mortar strikes and also 130mm rocket strikes impacting in this general area. All of the fire, of course, as always, being ISR directed. As that was going on, there were a few mortar strikes occurring over here as well, with 2 mortars hitting in the same area, cutting these armed reactionary civilians down. As CH-901A loitering munitions moved into this area, they hit these vehicles and destroyed these technicals. Even before these PLA forces had finished these guys off in a exchange of fire from vehicle turret machine guns and also the VN-20 firing its powerful 30mm autocannon as well as its 100mm cannon, which impacted these forces directly and cut them all down. As the ISR assets hovered over this area, they could see all of this, and these vehicles on the highway here, as others were crossing this portion right here early on in the fighting, these forces, these trucks moving up the highway, were all hit by these 3 CH-901A loitering munitions. These 2 entering the map here would essentially hit these armed civilians, as these were equipped with fragmentation warheads. The reason being was because there was no any type of armored forces within this particular battle space, and because they were fighting over key highways, mainly I-40, but also to a lesser extent State Highway 66, the option of using fragmentation warheads was a much better option to preserve the local infrastructure as much as possible, as this would do far less damage than an HE warhead or a heat warhead, and the parameters were set to light-skinned vehicles like these pickup trucks and civilian vehicles, and also the dismounted civilians. These were very effective weapons indeed for this particular type of fight that was occurring right here. As by the time of this fighting, what occurred was this platoon here had moved under the highway after these armed reactionary civilians had been all KIA'd, and as they moved under the highway, these guys heaved all their molotovs at the lead 2 vehicles, which had essentially caused them all to burn out, which forced the other 3 vehicles, the VN-20 and the other 2 APCs, to go around, as the they already knew these guys were here. They didn't send the VN-20 under first because of this. So they sent it later because they weren't really sure what these guys intended on doing. And although they Molotov these vehicles and the fire extinguishing system was not enough to put out the fires, and the guys had to bail because some of the crew were on fire, they had to roll around on the ground underneath this highway, they then bailed and got into the other 3 vehicles of their platoon, which after going under, after eliminating these guys trying to ambush them that they seen with their ISR assets first, they had dismounted their squads after moving up a little further. After firing at these guys a bit, they dismounted their squads who fired their 35 millimeter grenades at them, which caused them to disperse the area after a few were wounded when a grenade landed near the dividing the dividing rails. They fled either way, but by that time the loitering munitions had come in and wiped them all out. These two right here that were entering the picture, they had wiped these guys out, which caused the dismounts to then face other threats that were also spotted via ISR assets. They were now fighting these armed civilians after these CH-901As had already blasted some of the pickup trucks they had arrived in the area within. And then a heated exchange was now taking place between the VN-20's 100mm main gun, its 30mm autocannon, just shredding these guys up, firing through this wooded area they were trying to hide behind and fire at them from, and the heavy machine gun fire coming from the vehicle-based fires. As that was going on and these vehicles were burning up, they had dispatched their headquarters platoon of this company. The headquarters platoon had dispatched their armored recovery vehicle, which was the new Type 15 armored recovery vehicle based off the Type 15 tank, light tank chassis. And this vehicle was ideal for these lighter mechanized infantry forces because their vehicles could easily be towed by this system, and sent them beneath the highway to wait until the fires burned out, as ammunition was now cooking off inside of these 2 vehicles and it sounded like popcorn. So they waited just underneath the highway underpass while the vehicles that had protruded from it were burning. And these vehicles had already moved up by this point, so they were a safe enough distance away. As ammunition cooked off, it could be dangerous. Even bigger ammunition could definitely be dangerous to dismounts that were nearby, but because it wasn't they weren't pressurized, being fired through a barrel, they were mostly contained within these armored vehicles as they cooked off. As these forces had been in an enhanced long firefight with these forces that had been in the prone position, using the earth to basically try to take cover behind and doing a lot of spraying and praying, eventually they were all finally cut down by the sheer volume of fire from the 30mm autocannon and its blasting ammunition, its HE ammunition, as well as also the 100mm main gun, which was irresistible to these forces, as in they could not stand up against that. That was too destructive. And these forces coming across the highway were also now heavily engaged in a firefight as they reached this position here, and they too were eventually all cut down by the fires. After ISR assets directing this firefight had seen these guys coming in, they then opened fire on them heavily, as these first guys that didn't get wiped out by the mortar strike that had moved over this area were fighting them, and they were all eventually cut down, which led to these forces moving and smashing through this thinly wooded area here, and these 2 thinly wooded areas here, and here also this other second one, and then through here, where these 2 forces dismounted their squads and got into a firefight with the remainder of the men that made it across the highway, that did not get blasted by the artillery fire as it wiped these guys out and all of these guys over here, or mortar fire. The others that made it over got into a back and forth firefight as they came down this embankment that, as this was an elevated part of the highway here. As they came down, they were engaged with these forces, but were quickly cut down and KIA'd, leading to all of these guys being KIA'd.
By which point in other parts of the battle, other actions had already occurred, such as these strikes here in this area that wiped out nearly all of these dismounts. And although there was a truck moving through the area, a pickup truck off the highway here that were moving into the area with these armed reactionary civilians, the volume of fire coming from this other platoon that stayed in this area was too heavy, and the 100 millimeter shells and 30 millimeter autocannon ammunition just shredded these guys up, as this was not a long distance for those weapons. This was only, being that this was whole map is only a kilometer north to south. This is only about 450 meters. They were easy to tear up with heavy machine gun fire and also the weapon systems on the VN-20. And they were all seen through the infrared and night vision optics of the ISR drones. Even if the optics had a hard time seeing through some of the pine wooded areas, the fact that the drones helped them orient their fire made all the difference in the world. And these forces over here, these two dismounted squads, were already engaged in a firefight with a few of these guys over here that were moving through this area before these CH-901A loitering munitions hit these trucks, these two trucks right here, with this one being destroyed from rocket fire landing in the area. As they moved into this area, they moved temporarily off the map and began to clear this building. They began to clear this building right here, this business, before having fired out the window at these guys, those that were still alive from this group of three right here, as one on the end that was firing around the corner at these guys got cut down. And this squad moved into position and laid down fire on enemies early on before moving again without there being any green around the arrow, because there was no more resistance in this quadrant of the battlefield. With this force coming through here and holding this building that had just cleared this building, this squad right here moving in here. So by that point, this entire quadrant was completely clear of enemy activity, and the main fighting, although a lot of this fighting here had been basically dealt with already and wrapped up. Early on in the fighting, as many different things were going on at the same time early on, there had been fighting with armed civilians in this woods, just as the fire was also being directed at the groups they could see, where the highway was only slightly elevated here before it got even higher to go over this overpass. They were opening fire at these forces as fire was directed at them. And they lost a soldier KIA'd out of this squad right here, while these others were doing a rolling shield double column formation behind their armored personnel carrier, their Type-89A here. VN-20 was right here and had moved its turret to fire at these guys, orienting their fire over here as they were scanning their sector of fire. And these guys opened fire as well with everything they had. They fired their Type-69 rocket-propelled grenade anti-personnel rounds from the troops at these forces. They also fired their HJ-08 anti-tank missiles at forces up here, and their 35 millimeter tube-fired barrel-mounted grenades at these forces, and wiped them all out with their small arms as well, with their QJB-201 light machine guns that the machine gunner had. And then they moved into this area, taking a little fire from the personnel running up the highway, but they returned fire, and eventually, with also firing some heavier weapons at these forces on this side of the highway that they could see, they eventually finished them all off, as they could fire their barrel-mounted grenades quite a distance, as this here was only about 300 meters from their position. They could fire them that far. And as these forces now, this squad right here in this line formation and this squad in a line formation behind them, had now moved up in an L shape originally to finish these guys off as they were fighting them here, and then refocused all their efforts at these forces, reforming into a wedge, as they first were a line and then they reformed into a wedge, which is why the green is like this. And at the time, they were taking fire temporarily from these guys when some got here, but they helped in finishing them off with the same types of weapons that this squad was using after these guys were completely wiped out. Now, these two platoons of vehicles right here had not dismounted their forces yet, and had, although early on taken fire from these guys up here on this highway bridge, had fired back at them, including with the VN-20s of these two platoons firing at them with their 30mm autocannons, even firing at these forces that were hiding where the concrete, basically there were these concrete inclines where the highway bridge came across. There were these concrete inclines beneath it where there were 3 guys here, 2 guys here, and 3 guys right here hiding and firing at them. They had returned fire, KIA'd these guys. KIA'd these guys as their squads had dismounted and were taking fire. At the same time all of this was going on, these guys had dismounted and were taking fire from some of these guys and helped in the return fire effort with these squads here and over here. And the squad that was dismounted on this side from a Type-89A behind the VN-20 where they dismounted their squad right here had moved into the highway, taken up positions facing these guys and these guys taking fire and returning fire, while this squad bounded and covered tactically behind them, bounding here before stopping and holding their position, aiming up at these guys after the guys under the bridge had been taken out, allowing for this squad to cross the guardrails and get to this side and then take up position behind here. After here, they had greased these 2 guys that hadn't been KIA'd by artillery fire. They fired a few grenades, 35mm, from their barrel-fired grenade systems and just wiped these guys out. And by the time they got here, they helped finish off these guys up on this bridge. And guys back here that they can now see directly with their weapons, although they knew they were there from ISR, they couldn't directly engage them due to the angle of fire, and now they could, and they finished these guys off. So now they held both sides of the highway as the forces had bounded across. After this squad made it here and took position here, this squad bounded across behind them and was now guarding their backs here. With the 4 quadrants secure on either side of this highway intersection with I-40 and the highway segment connecting 40 and 66, the state highway, these forces now over here were orienting all of their fire against the remainder of these forces that had slipped through and were making it over here. They were now firing at them from the back, as again, these CH-901As had already hit their pickup trucks. And there were forces hiding behind this building on this side, and there were some leaving the building now. And they were being engaged by this platoon that came in after this platoon had come in, losing a few vehicles. And this vehicle, one Type-89A, went this way, another Type-89A had gone this way, and the VN-20 had gone this way, finishing off this truck early on from when they were moving through the area, as primarily these vehicles had focused on these enemies right here, with this truck coming into the scene now continuing to move up and being shredded up when these vehicles were all here in a line after these forces had been KIA'd by the CH-901A loitering munitions that had targeted them. So now these split up after eliminating these guys over here that were hiding in some of the behind a concrete abutment that had some bushes in it. They had been spotted and were wiped out by these forces. And also these forces had fired in their direction as well. As they came in after this platoon, they all fired on these forces before they completely oriented everything at these guys, before these vehicles then split up to go their own ways. And they had destroyed this truck that had moved into the area and was now continuing to move down the street that had some molotovs in the back of it, but they were not having that. They completely shredded them up with heavy machine gun fire from this Type-89A that was in a line at the time this vehicle was moving into this area, and had opened fire on them and completely destroyed them. I'm trying to convey all this in as rational of an order as possible, and it's very difficult because of all the different things occurring on the map happening at roughly the same time, but this is about as close to an order as it can be, as these vehicles fanned out after this truck had been destroyed. These guys had been destroyed. This truck had been destroyed while trying to flee. And then these guys being destroyed, hiding behind the gas station. These vehicles fanned out and were taking fire from guys coming around the back of this building here. And had then, in turn, after dismounting a squad here, which the squad followed the VN-20, which is why you see this little arrow right here. They followed behind them. They went around and completely wiped these guys out with this Type-89A after they had eliminated the enemies in the parking lot. They went here as well after wiping these guys out on this side of the building, as all this was ISR directed. There were enemies off the map just barely that were here too. They were firing at them, both vehicles. As they moved up a bit, this vehicle staying a little further back behind the VN-20 for better orientation of fire before they then proceeded to scan their sectors as the squad dismounted from this armored personnel carrier, followed them up here and was still by their side in a rolling shield double column formation, as was the case with this VN-20, because they had already, way back here, KIA'd these guys on this side of the building. These guys were a little better protected, but not for long, as this armored personnel carrier with its dismounted squad had opened fire on and shredded them after they moved into position, with this other one rolling up here, helping these guys to finish off these remaining still alive armed civilians moving into this area, as they were taking fire and losing some guys by the time they got here. And the last ones, by making it to this parking lot, had been all KIA'd by that point. As these guys had left this building, they then too were opened up on by this armored personnel carrier moving to be able to see between these buildings and cut these guys up as they were fleeing the area as well, and cut them all down. This guy right here, this guy here that had been taking some fire from these guys now firing from here, because this gave them a good angle to see between the highway, I-40, and this building. And they had cut these guys down and were firing on these guys when they were running here, and now they were being fired at through these two buildings and being cut down. And as this truck had taken a little bit of fire when it went around this road here, they were fleeing the map, and they got out of this particular area alive. This truck and these three dismounts, they got out of here alive while taking fire, because the fire had just missed them, as the truck was hauling ass at this point and even went around these guys. But then they were taking fire from the front by another company helping these two to close in on this area, as there's another company down here and another spread out on this a bit off the map, like another 500 meters off the map and away from these artillery shellings. And they were all surrounding this area. I mean, they're a bit further out than that, but yeah, this truck was forced out of another area because of one of the companies that was surrounding it. Well, this company came in to flush this quadrant and this quadrant, and this other company came in to flush this quadrant and this quadrant that was already hit by artillery, with these imminent strikes hitting here at the opening of the map, wiping these guys out before they could get up the embankment and onto the highway. Although these were close to the interstate, they were calculated to not put the highway at any severe risk, so they were done, and they wiped these guys out. Same with the mortar strike from the 120mm mortar and this artillery strike right here, just narrowly avoiding doing any damage to the interstate, as was these two mortar strikes that came in together in tandem. As this battle here was the last 40 minutes of the fighting, the armored recovery vehicle, after the flames finally burned themselves out, had moved under the highway, grabbed the first vehicle, and towed it away to the headquarters platoon's position before moving back and towing the other one away. By this point, the area had been thoroughly secured, as the Type-89A, after encountering combat here, had moved in and set up its position here with other forces off map, not very far, but a little further, that forced this truck originally into this area to begin with, as well as this one. They now had flushed the area out officially, and this battle, ending at 5 a.m., was the final flank clearance operation, and the reason it had taken so long
was because of the methodical clearance of the area due to so many armed civilians moving into it to begin with from the initial artillery strikes that had occurred not very far from the northern group that moved into this particular area. And they also had to try to protect the infrastructure of the highway as much as possible and capture it as much intact as possible. And they also had to clear all the buildings moving inward as they methodically went down the streets looking for these armed civilians that moved into the area and began hiding all over the place. So to ferret all of them out like that took a lot of time and effort, because this was mechanized infantry doing this with some good artillery support for sure, but it took time because of the groupings of these armed civilians, and they had no communication. So these were literally like different groupings of armed civilians that were working together in tiny bands, which caused them all to go in different areas within the pocket. And they all had to be removed and rooted out from this area, which was Yukon, the suburb known as Yukon. It was Yukon area here. And they all had to be ferreted out all throughout this urban area known as Yukon. It was an outer suburb of OKC, in other words, between OKC and El Reno. So these forces, after 3.5 hours, which was still fairly rapid, all things considered, for an operation like this, but it was slower than other operations that had occurred on the larger map. After that area had been fully taken by the mechanized infantry, this was literally the last of the flank clearing operations to secure key highway infrastructure. Now that the key highways were all secured, the final fighting that would occur on this map would predominantly be in the downtown area in its two pockets, with one other instance of combat unfolding against the last major American military combat unit, which will be explored in the next video, the 1st Squadron of the 180th Cav Regiment, which was a battalion element of Cav troops. This was a target acquisition and reconnaissance element predominantly, and they were equipped with Bradley infantry fighting vehicles and, of course, their support vehicles, and some M113 armor personnel carriers. And they were known to be in this area as per intelligence reporting ascertained prior to the invasion, but they didn't really know for sure until they would present themselves, as they were all inside of buildings and they weren't seen immediately early on, but they would be engaged in short order.